Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. This is your brother Lawrence, and the Southern Adventist University has responded to Fulcrum 7 concerning a recent post. I'm going to share with you the details right now, but don't forget to also follow us on Facebook and also on WhatsApp. Don't forget to use AdventistBusinessPromo.com if you need any product or service from Adventist business owners across the globe. You can also add your business or service if you have one. All right, so the link is in the description. Use it and support Adventist owned businesses across the globe. Now let's get to the main story. On 15th of October 2025, Fulcrum 7 published this news article, and it says, Turning Point USA gets a chapter at Southern University. Now, for those who may want to know more, Turning Point USA is an organization, should I say political organization? Is a political organization that was led by Charlie Kirk, who was recently assassinated. All right, this organization seems to focus on high schools and college campuses, and you know what they do right there. So you can search more on Turning Point USA if you want to know more about that organization. Now, as I said earlier, Fulcrum 7 published a news article that Turning Point is now on the campus of Southern Adventist University. But few days after the publication, the university actually came out and shared that what Fulcrum 7 published was not correct. So I want to share with you what the Southern Adventist University actually published in response to Fulcrum 7 recent post. All right, so it says, breaking news: Turning Point USA is not opening an official chapter at Southern Adventist University, according to Dennis Negro, Vice President for Student Development. And the post continues to say, Fulcrum 7 recently reported that there is a new Turning Point USA startup at Southern Adventist University. The claim was supported by a screenshot of Turning Point USA's website, which lists Southern Adventist University on its chapter map. Turning Point is a political organization that works to spread conservative ideas and influence among young people in educational settings across the United States. However, according to Dennis Negron, Vice President for Student Development, Turning Point USA is not opening an official chapter at Southern. So friends, this is what has come out from Southern Adventist University. And the question is, who is telling the truth? You can decide for yourself. Now, turning away from this story to another story, Pastor Conrad Vine actually released a sermon recently that is going viral. And did you get a chance to watch that sermon, friends? Did you get the chance to watch that sermon? This part of the sermon is very, very interesting. That is the part of the sermon that I really like. All right, so let's go ahead and watch this part of the sermon. I will put the full video in the description for those who want to watch the full sermon. Okay, so let's watch this, friends. Let's watch this.
You must understand this, that in the last days distressing times will come. So where does Paul write this passage from? Paul writes this just before he dies. This is the last letter Paul dies before his head is taken off by Nero in the persecutions of Rome. Paul knows he's about to die. In 2 Timothy chapter 5, he knows that he's about to be offered as an offering to God, as a libation to God. He knows he's in prison, he's waiting his execution by Nero. And in chapter 1 and verse 15, Paul talks about the fact that everybody in Turkey has repudiated or denied him or denounced him. And in chapter 2 of this book here, he writes that young protege, Timothy, and he says, never be ashamed of the gospel, but take part in share in the suffering of the gospel, because you're Christ's good soldier. And then Paul goes on to speak about the church in the end of days, and he's talking about those who are lost in the church. And he says this: you must understand this, that in the last days distressing times will come. 2 Timothy 3 and verse 1. And so I've highlighted the phrase distressing times. Why have I highlighted that? Because that verb, and this is kairoi chalestoi, that word distressing, chalestoi, That word also appears in the New Testament in Matthew 8 when it speaks of the two demoniacs. And it says they were so fierce that no one could pass their way. And so Paul is saying that in the church, at the end of time, there's going to be a fierceness among people, almost a demon possession within the church. The word itself means difficult, violent, dangerous, or hard to bear. And so Paul says that in the last days, within the church, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be dangerous, it's going to be hard to bear. There's a threat of demonically inspired violence within the church at the end of time, when you parallel the Greek with Matthew 8:28 there. And what is the conduct of people who are lost in the church at the end of time? Well, we find that in 2 Timothy 3, verses 2 through 4. And Paul says there, you see it on the screen, it says, "For people will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, inhuman, implacable, slanderers, profligates, brutes, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God." That's quite a list, yes? And that's in the church, from Paul to the end of time. That's how Paul's going to describe how people are going to be within the church. Now you notice that Paul begins with two phrases, lovers of, and he concludes with two phrases, lovers of. We start out that people will be lovers of themselves and lovers of money. Then we finish with the phrase, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. So this passage starts with those who are lovers of self and lovers of money, and it concludes with lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. So these people are loving everything except God himself. They love self, they love pleasure, and they love money. That's what's driving the rest of this little passage here. They don't love God, they love themselves. The self is on the throne on their hearts. They love pleasure. The pursuit of pleasure is what drives their lives. And they love money. They'll do anything for that extra buck. And so this passage, we start with people who love themselves, and we conclude with people who love anything except God himself. So let's look in a bit more detail. We break this passage down into what Paul says about the church all the way through to the end of time, and this is our time today. So the first five words he uses there. This section deals in detail about what self-love looks like. If you're a lover of yourself, there are 5 things that Paul says about you. The first thing he says there, and you see it upon the screen, I've put the Greek on the left, on the right I've put the corresponding translation into English. If you are a lover of self, it means that 1 Corinthians 13:5 says that love does not insist on its own way. But if you are a lover of self, it means you insist on your own way all the time. You're not willing to compromise, you're not willing to yield. It's my way or the highway. Then the next word he uses there is lovers of money. Literally, it's lovers of silver in the Greek there. 1 Timothy 6:10, he writes earlier to this young preacher, Timothy, he says, "For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil." So lovers of self engage in love. They're lovers of money. They insist on their own way. The next word is braggarts or boastful. That is, they boast of their own self-sufficiency rather than accept the righteousness of Christ. Why? Because self is on the throne of the heart rather than Christ himself. Then we have the word proud or disdainful. Because they're so full of themselves, they look down on others, and they're incredibly judgmental. And they tear down and they criticize people that don't meet their supposedly high standards. And then the last word that Paul uses there for the lovers of self is they're slanderous. The word is blasphemoi there. It's slanderous or blasphemous. Why are they blasphemous? Because they worship self rather than God. The first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. But if self is on the throne of your heart, and you are a lover of self rather than a lover of God, it means your life is a life of blasphemy. You worship yourself. You do everything that is good for yourself. I met a father the other day, and he said, he said, "You warned me, Conrad." He said, "You warned me that there would come a time when my daughter would spend all her waking moments in front of a mirror." I said, "Yeah, that's true." He said, "That moment has now arrived." And I said, "Well, learn to say hello at meal times, because you're not going to see her for any other part of the day." But it is true that in America we have this epidemic of narcissism and people taking selfies of each other. And not only do they take selfies, but they have these little apps that dress them up and make themselves look really nice. I had somebody write to me just recently. I was on a YouTube video, and this lady wrote to me and she says, "Please, could you advise me? Your skincare looks really good. What do you do for skincare?" And I didn't know how to respond to his comments, so I thought, well, I'm going to be tongue-in-cheek. I know this is a lady, and she doesn't know that on my computer I've got like this softening filter on, so it kind of softens the creases on your face. Some of you, if you get that on Zoom, okay, you can kind of soften the thing, yes? And so I wrote back to this lady and says that the key to having good health care, skin care, is have a wet shave every morning. I'm not sure if she followed my advice, but that was my advice to her. But we have an epidemic of narcissism within our society today, of self-love and self-promotion. And not only is we have this narcissism, but people are withdrawing into their own homes because there's a difference between the me on social media and the real me. And this is particularly prevalent among teenage girls. That's what the research shows. Teenage girls don't want to be seen in public with other friends. They're withdrawing into themselves socially because they have this ideal digital version of themselves on the internet, and they don't want people to see the real me. And so we have this isolationism growing in our teen community today because I don't want people to see the real me. It's better they just see the digital me. And the next section of this passage deals with family relationships and in particular how young people relate to their parents. So Paul says here, there's 5 adjectives he uses here. This section discusses how teenagers, young children relate to parents, particularly in the church at the end of time. The first thing he says is their disobedience to their parents, in direct opposition to the 5th commandment, which is thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother. The second thing that Paul says about them is they're ungrateful. Now, on the screen there, each of the words there, the pointer doesn't work on the screen there, but after the first one, where it says ungrateful without any appreciation, each of the Greek words after that begins with the word a. And that means without. So what Paul is saying is that at the end of time, family relationships will be characterized not by the presence of that which is good, but by the absence of that which is good. Without. And so Paul repeatedly uses the A there, which is the families in the church at the end of time will be families without that which is good and pure and noble and makes for building up. The first thing he says is they're going to be without appreciation, acharistoi, otherwise known as ungrateful. That is, young people at the end of time will be ungrateful for the blessings their parents give them. So I'm not going to ask about how your family is, or your experience of being a teenager today, or your relationship with your parents, or I'm not going to ask today if you're a parent raising teenagers. But at the end of time, there's going to be an epidemic of ingratitude, or otherwise known as entitlement. That you owe it to me. I deserve this. I don't have to work or earn for it. This is mine by right. I was born into a wealthy society. I deserve the fruits of that wealthy society without putting the effort into it myself. The next verb he uses is without holiness. The word better translation is without piety towards God. That within families, Christian families at the end of time, as Paul says in Romans 3:18, there is no fear of God before their eyes. There is no respect at family worship. There is a rejection of the call to pray and worship within the family. We then turn the next adjective that Paul uses is without natural affection. That is, as time goes on, we are going to see an increase or a decrease in natural affection between parents and children and parents and brothers and sisters. That the bonds of natural affection, bonds of family loyalty, bonds of I'm going to look out for you because you are my blood, those bonds are going to be loosened until they're all gone. And then we find the last adjective that Paul uses here is without reason. That is, they're unwilling to engage in dialogue. They're unwilling to engage in reasonable discussion. They're implacable. We have to do it my way or I'm running out of the house. And this is how Paul describes families in the church at the end of time. Without gratitude, without holiness, without natural affection, without reason, without a willingness to compromise or discuss anything. The last few words that Paul puts in this list here of the church at the end of time, I'll put it up there on the screen. And this deals less with family relationships, and it deals with more antisocial behavior. So the first thing that Paul says is, in Christian families at the end of time, is they will be diaboloi. That's the word diabolos, means the devil. The word devil means a slanderer. That means they engage in the breaking of the 9th commandment, bearing false witness against their neighbors. So truth is far from their lips. And these days we're living in a society where truth is far from the public square, yes? If you tell a lie often enough, it becomes journalism these days. And so today we're living in a society where everybody just wants to lie, everybody wants to push their narrative, and if the facts don't meet their narrative, then they're not going to report the facts. That's where we are in a society. It also says the next adjective is without self-control. A better interpretation is that they live only for pleasure and the pursuit of pleasure regardless of morality. And this isn't in the world that Paul is talking about. Paul is talking about in the church. At the end of time, people will live for the pursuit of pleasure without moral restraint, moral licentiousness. This is the Roman Empire collapsed because of moral decay on the inside. And the American Empire will collapse, not because of external and physical threat, but because of moral decay within our midst. We no longer know, as our brother said earlier today, we no longer know as a society what is right or what is wrong. We also have the word savage there, without humanity. That is, within society, people will show brutal violence one towards another, seeking their destruction. The next word is without love for that which is good, or without love for other good men. That is, we're going to be living in a church and a society where the holiness of others repulses us because it calls out the sinfulness in our own lives. So when we're in such a society, people naturally segregate themselves, not along racial lines, but they segregate into groups that affirm their own understanding of morality and what is right or wrong. And we see that polarization within our church. We see that polarization within American society today. People are, if you are, let's say, a member of the trans community, or you're a furry in the furry community, you have more loyalty and love and empathy for and an affiliation with the furry community than often with your own biological family of origin. And so we see this division taking place, just as the Apostle Paul said, without love for that which is good in other men. And then the next verse is traitors. That is, just like Judas in Luke 6:16. That is, within the church, there'll be people who betray Christ and the body of Christ. The last couple of adjectives there at the bottom there. The first one there is reckless. It means entirely thoughtless of others in word and deed, unconcerned for the well-being of others. And then you have puffed up or conceited or filled with pride. We're coming back to the lovers of self at the beginning of the list. Then we finish out this description of the church at the end of time, where Paul says they are lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. This is the church, not the world. This is the church. Somebody said, have mercy. Amen to that. Have mercy upon us. So what we have in the church are lovers of self, lovers of pleasure, and lovers of money rather than lovers of God. God's order is that we love God first and then our neighbor as ourselves. And but in the church at the end of time, that order is going to be reversed. No longer will we love God first and then our neighbor as ourselves. Now we're lovers of ourselves first, we're lovers of God last. And when we love ourselves first and God last, then our neighbor who's caught in the middle inevitably suffers. And so we have a coldness, a reduction in love towards our neighbor within our midst, because we become lovers of self. And I'll help you only if it's good for me. I'll help you only if it benefits me. I'll help you and stand by you only if it benefits me. But I'm not going to stand by you. I'm not going to stand with you. I'm not going to stand up for you. I'm not going to help you in any way, shape, or form if it compromises my positional standing in the church. The Apostle Paul concludes this section by saying that in this church at the end of time, they will hold fast to the outward form of godliness, but denying its power. He says, avoid such people. There will be lovers of self, money, and pleasure rather than God within the church, and we are to avoid such people. It's a sobering warning, yes? We spoke earlier in our Sabbath school about looking in the mirror, and all joking aside, it is time to look in the mirror and ask ourselves whether Paul's description of the church at the end of time bears any resonance with how I live my life today. Am I a lover of self? Am I a lover of pleasure? Am I a lover of money? And is my love of God secondary to everything else that we've just mentioned? Now, this phenomenon is not new. In the Old Testament, in Amos 2, verse 8, we read there, they lay themselves down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge, and in the house of their God they drink wine bought with fines that they imposed. So this is, Amos was speaking, he was from Judah in the south. God called him to go north to the kingdom of Israel. Israel was living under the reign of Jeroboam II, who promised to make Israel great again, and that's what he did. Under Jeroboam II, that's the time of the prophet Jonah, Israel became great. They conquered almost all the territory that Solomon had once ruled over. But during Jeroboam's reign, there was an economic boom, but there was also a boom of injustice within society. And then because of this injustice within society, the God sends a prophet Isaiah, and prophet Isaiah says this. He's talking about the religious life of God's people. He says, your new moons and your appointed festivals, my soul hates. They become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you stretch out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. That's among God's people. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your doing from before my eyes. Cease to do evil, learn to do good. Seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, and plead for the widows. So God says, I don't care about your Sabbath morning services in the Temple of Jerusalem because you're engaged in violence to one towards the other all the way through the rest of the week. In fact, not only in Isaiah 58 do you gather for worship, but when you're sitting in worship, you're eagerly waiting for worship to finish so that you can go out and hurt your neighbor. And this is in Amos's time, this is in Isaiah's time, this was before the fall of Jerusalem. You know, this is a side story, but there's a professor at Andrews who's a recent widow, and she called me, and she'd been referred to me by some other professors, and she had on video like 4 or 5 big groundhogs. They dug a hole in the middle of her garden, and the hole was about 2 feet across, and it went down like a drilling to the center of the earth. It went straight down. I'd never seen anything like it before. And she called me in distress about these things, and she says, well, please, can you take care of them? I said to her, well, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And so she texted me the pictures, and there's like a colony of these things there. And she said, well, how much is it going to cost? I said, it's not going to cost you anything. She said, what do you mean? I said, well, if you're a non-Adventist, I'd charge you this much. I said, but you're an Adventist, so I'm not going to charge you, and particularly, I said, because you're a widow. I said, and I know you have one income, you've got a family, and true religion is this, to help widows and orphans in their distress. So I'm going to take care of this problem for free for you because I know you're a widow. She was very tearful over that. And when my wife left Andrew's employment just recently and they had their leaving due, this dear sister stood up and she spoke very tearfully about how my wife's husband had come and killed all these groundhogs for free because she was a widow. I had no idea it made such an impact in her life. I mean, she could restore her garden again and so forth. But true religion is to look out for the weak and voiceless within your society. And God is not so concerned about us sitting in church on Sabbath morning. He does want that, but he's concerned that this changes how we live our lives and relate to other people around us. Matthew 23, verse 25, Jesus discusses the relationship between form of religion and the power of religion. It says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. And so in the last days, people will have the outward form of religion, but they will deny the power of Christ within them to turn them into a new creation. That is, they have the form of religion, but they don't have the power of religion. They have the form of religion and the practice of religion, but they don't have the inner transformation that God wants for us in each of our lives. It is a religion without morals. It is faith without works. True religion combines both form and power. It is not just an external form without internal power. That's legalism. I live the visible Christian life, but inside I'm unconverted and I'm not changed by the Holy Spirit. That's just legalism. I look good, everybody thinks he's a good Christian man, but my home is an absolute mess. And that's legalism, and it's hypocrisy. And the opposite is also true. If you don't have the form of religion and you just have the inner transformation, your religion is basically sentimentalism. And it's not transforming how you live your life and how you relate to those around you. True religion in the Gospels arises from a transformed heart that leads to transformed relationships with others. True religion is one that engages in private and public worship of God, and it results in moral behavior towards our neighbors. So you have both the form of religion and you have the power of religion to transform from the inside out. Anything less is worthless, it's an abomination to God, and it leads to God's judgment upon his people. So we can be lost in despair in the world, and we can also be lost in the church. Lost in the church.
All right, friends, that was Pastor Conrad Vine. You can share your thoughts in the comments concerning the issue of Fulcrum 7 and Southern Adventist University, and also you can share your thoughts on the sermon by Pastor Conrad Vine. There are more stories coming up, so don't go anywhere. Thanks for watching. See you again. God bless.